The bullet hit the stone wall 6 inches from Corporal Eddie McGuire's face at 7:14 in the morning on December 19, 1944. He didn't hear it coming. Nobody ever hears the one that almost kills them. The round arrived before the sound, the way a rifle bullet always does at distance. And what Eddie heard was the crack of stone splitting apart, and the whine of rock fragments spraying across the frozen ground, and the wet slap of something sharp cutting into the sandbag next to his ear. He was flat on his stomach before his brain finished processing what had happened. Face pressed into frozen Belgian mud breath, coming in short, hard gasps that turned to fog in the December air. His hands were shaking. His helmet had been knocked sideways by a chunk of masonry the size of a man's thumb, and a thin line of blood ran down his temple where the fragment had grazed him. From somewhere on the ridge to the east, a German sniper had just told him that the distance between living and dying was 6 inches and a gust of wind. The second shot came 4 seconds later. It punched through the top of the stone wall exactly where Eddie's head had been, sending another spray of rock dust across the position. The German was shooting from somewhere around 800 yards. Maybe more. The shots were coming from the tree line on the eastern ridge, which meant elevation advantage concealment in the dense Ardennes forest and a field of fire that covered the entire American forward position like a blanket. Eddie pressed himself flatter against the earth and tried to think. He had an M1 carbine. The M1 carbine was a fine weapon for what it was designed to do. It was light-handy, easy to carry, fired a pistol-caliber cartridge that was effective against human targets at ranges up to maybe 200 yards on a good day, with a steady hand and no wind. It was the weapon the Army issued to officers, radio men, mortar crews, and support personnel who needed something better than a pistol, but who were not expected to engage in sustained rifle combat at infantry ranges. What the M1 carbine was not by any measure, by any standard, by any definition that any weapons manual had ever put to paper, was a precision rifle capable of reaching across 800 yards of frozen Belgian forest and finding a single man hidden in a tree line. The German knew this. Every German sniper on the Western Front knew what weapons the Americans carried and what those weapons could do. The man on that ridge had calculated his position with the same cold precision that German snipers were trained to apply to every engagement. He was far enough away that no American weapon in Eddie's section could touch him. He was high enough that the angle made return fire from the valley nearly impossible. He was concealed well enough that even if someone could shoot that far, they would have nothing to aim at. He was by every doctrinal standard of the Second World War perfectly safe. And in the 3 days since that sniper had established himself on the eastern ridge, 11 Americans had died. One shot at a time, one life at a time. Methodical, patient, professional. Eddie McGuire lay in the mud and listened to the silence that followed the second shot, and thought about his father's fishing boat on Penobscot Bay, and about a spool of monofilament line that was sitting at the bottom of his pack, and about a broken rifle scope he had found in a ditch 2 days ago. He was thinking about something that would get him laughed out of the company if he said it out loud. He was thinking about turning a carbine into a sniper rifle using fishing wire. To understand why Eddie McGuire was lying in frozen mud in the Ardennes forest on the 4th day of the Battle of the Bulge, you have to understand Thomaston, Maine. And to understand Thomaston, you have to understand what the Atlantic Ocean does to the men who work on it. Thomaston sits on the western shore of Penobscot Bay, about 80 miles up the coast from Portland. In 1944, it was a town of maybe 2,500 people who made their living from the sea. Lobster boats left the harbor before dawn and came back after dark. The men who worked those boats were hard in ways that had nothing to do with muscles, though they had those too. They were hard, the way granite is hard, shaped by pressure and cold, and the understanding that the ocean does not forgive carelessness. Eddie's father, Thomas McGuire, had fished the waters off Penobscot Bay since he was 14 years old. He was not a large man, 5'9", 160 pounds, with hands that were permanently red and cracked from salt water and rope burn. But he could read water the way a professor reads a book. He could look at the surface of the bay on a January morning and tell you where the current was running, where the temperature break was, where the lobsters had moved during the night, and whether the weather coming in from the northeast was going to hold off long enough to get a full day's work in, or whether it was time to pull traps and run for the harbor. Thomas McGuire did not teach his son to fish by explaining theories. He taught him by putting him on the boat at age 7 and making him work. Here is a lobster trap. Here is how you bait it. Here is how you set the line so the buoy sits right and the trap drops clean and the current doesn't drag the whole rig into the rocks. Pay attention. Do it again. Do it right. The critical thing Thomas taught Eddie, the thing that would matter more than anything else on a frozen ridge in Belgium 20 years later, was how to tie a line. Commercial fishing knots are not like the knots a Boy Scout learns in a handbook. A Boy Scout knot has to hold a tent stake. A fishing knot has to hold a 1,000-pound trap against a North Atlantic current in 40-degree water, while being repeatedly stressed by wave action, salt corrosion temperature changes, and the simple mechanical wear of rope against metal. If a fishing knot fails, you lose equipment worth more money than most families in Thomaston had in savings. If it fails at the wrong time, in the wrong conditions, you lose a man. Thomas Maguire tied knots the way a surgeon ties sutures. He expected his son to do the same. Not fast, not sloppy, right. Every loop seated, every tension balanced, every connection tested before it went over the side. Eddie, tie that again. It's sloppy. Dad, it'll hold. Sloppy holds until it doesn't. Then it kills someone. Tie it right. Eddie would tie it again. And again. And sometimes again, after that, standing on the deck of the Mary Ellen in the gray light of a Maine dawn, his fingers numb from cold salt water until Thomas Maguire nodded once, which was the old man's way of saying the knot was right and his son was worth teaching. The other thing Thomas taught Eddie was patience. Not the lazy kind of patience where a man sits and waits because he has nothing better to do. The active kind. The kind where you sit absolutely still in a rocking boat at 4 a.m, watching the surface of the water in the beam of a spotlight, reading the movements of baitfish by the way the light catches their scales, waiting for the exact moment when the mackerel school moves into the right position before you throw the net. Most men threw too early. They saw the fish moving, and they threw immediately, reacting to what was happening instead of anticipating what was about to happen. They caught some fish. They always caught some. But they never caught as many as Thomas Maguire, who waited and waited and waited, and then threw the net at the exact moment when the school was at its densest and moving in the direction that would carry the most fish into the net rather than away from it. Patience is not waiting. Thomas said it once on a morning when Eddie had asked why they hadn't thrown the net yet when the fish were clearly right there. Patience is reading the situation until you know the right moment. Then you commit everything to that one moment. If you've read it right, you don't need a second throw. One throw, one net, one moment of total commitment backed by hours of careful reading. Eddie was 12 years old when the Depression hit Thomaston. The lobster market collapsed. Prices dropped from 40 cents a pound to 8 cents virtually overnight. The boats that had been the town's livelihood became its burden. Fuel cost money. Bait cost money. Trap repairs cost money. And the catch wasn't worth enough to cover the costs. Thomas Maguire adapted the way fishermen have always adapted when the sea stops providing. He diversified. He ran charter trips for the few tourists who still came to the Maine coast. He took odd jobs at the boatyard repairing hulls and replacing engines. He made his own fishing tackle from materials he could scavenge because buying new equipment was out of the question. And this is where the fishing wire comes in. Thomas Maguire taught his son to work with monofilament line the way a jeweler works with fine metal, not just tying it, but understanding its properties. Monofilament has specific tensile strength based on its diameter. It stretches under load, but only to a point, then it holds rigid. It can be wound tight enough to create binding pressure that rivals a metal clamp if you know the right wrapping technique. It is transparent, weather resistant, and available in varying weights for different applications. Thomas and Eddie built their own fishing rigs from scratch. Custom leaders, custom line setups, custom knot systems designed for specific conditions. They used monofilament to repair lobster trap frames, to secure buoys to lash equipment to the deck when weather came up faster than expected. They discovered that properly wound monofilament layered in overlapping wraps with each layer seated against the previous one created a binding that was stronger than most metal clamps and had the advantage of absorbing vibration rather than transmitting it. That last property, that vibration absorption, that was the thing that would matter in Belgium. But first, 1938 happened. Thomas Maguire went out on October 17th to pull traps ahead of a nor'easter that was building off Cape Cod. The weather service said they had 12 hours before the storm arrived. The weather service was wrong. The storm came in 6 hours early, with 40-knot winds and seas that went from 4 feet to 15 in less than an hour. Thomas Maguire never came back. They found the Mary Ellen 3 days later capsized and broken on the rocks off Owl's Head, about 8 miles south of the harbor. They never found Thomas. The sea kept him. Eddie was 18 years old. He had a mother, Ruth, a younger sister, Annie, who was 12, and a fishing boat that was at the bottom of Penobscot Bay. No insurance, no savings, no father. Ruth McGuire took in laundry and mending. Annie helped. Eddie took the only job available to a young man with no boat and no money in a Depression-era fishing town. He went to work at the sardine cannery in Rockland, 12 miles south, for 22 cents an hour. He worked 10-hour shifts. Came home smelling of fish and machine oil. Gave every cent to his mother and sat on the porch in the dark, staring at the bay and thinking about the knots his father had taught him and the patience his father had demonstrated and the lesson about reading a situation until you knew the right moment and then committing everything to that one moment. He enlisted on December 9th, 1941, 2 days after Pearl Harbor. He was 21 years old, 6 feet tall, 170 pounds, with hands that were scarred and calloused from 4 years of cannery work, and before that, 7 years of hauling lobster traps in North Atlantic water. He had never fired a rifle. He had never been south of Portland. He had never been more than 30 miles from the ocean his father had died in. At Fort Benning, they assigned him to a headquarters company and gave him an M1 carbine because he was classified as support personnel, not a rifleman. The carbine was a short, light weapon that fired a .30 caliber pistol round at modest velocity. It was designed for men who needed a weapon for self-defense, not for men who were expected to close with and destroy the enemy at rifle range. Eddie didn't question the assignment. He was a fisherman's son who had spent his adult life gutting sardines. He didn't think of himself as a combat soldier. He thought of himself as a man doing his job the same way he had done every job since he was 7 years old. With care, with patience, with attention to detail that came from growing up in an environment where carelessness killed. What nobody at Fort Benning knew, because Eddie never mentioned it, and nobody thought to ask, was that Thomas McGuire's fishing lessons had given his son a set of skills that were almost perfectly suited to precision shooting at extreme distances. Reading wind by watching the surface of water. Reading distance by judging the size of objects against the horizon. Understanding how a projectile, whether it was a lead sinker on a fishing line or a bullet from a rifle, behaved when affected by gravity, wind, and the drag of the medium it traveled through. Tying connections that absorbed vibration instead of amplifying it. And patience. The deep, active reading patience of a man who waited for hours for a single moment of perfect commitment. Eddie didn't know any of this yet. He wouldn't know it until December 1944, when a German sniper started killing Americans from a ridge that nobody could reach. And a fisherman's son looked at a broken scope and a spool of monofilament line and saw something that no one else in the United States Army had ever seen. Eddie McGuire arrived in France in August 1944, 2 months after D-Day, assigned to the 106th Infantry Division as a headquarters company clerk and occasional radio operator. He spent the fall of 1944 doing what headquarters personnel did in a moving army. He carried messages, maintained records, helped set up command posts, and tried to stay out of the way of the combat soldiers who were actually fighting the war. He was not a hero. He was not trying to be a hero. He was a 24-year-old former cannery worker from Maine who typed reports, organized supply requests, and slept in whatever building or foxhole was available when the division moved forward. His best friend in the unit was Private First Class Ray Pelletier, a 20-year-old kid from Lewiston, Maine, about 100 miles inland from Thomaston. Ray was Franco-American, the son of a shoe factory worker, and he had the kind of infectious energy that made everyone around him feel slightly less miserable about being in a war. Ray talked constantly. He talked about his girlfriend Louise. He talked about the shoe factory. He talked about the Red Sox. He talked about food, about home, about the future, about everything and nothing, with the enthusiasm of a young man who had not yet learned that the world could take those things away. Eddie and Ray had met on the troop ship crossing the Atlantic and had discovered the immediate bond that New Englanders feel when they find each other far from home. They spoke the same dialect, understood the same references, shared the same quiet stubbornness that the rest of the country sometimes mistook for unfriendliness, but was really just economy. Why use 10 words when 3 will do? Ray had made Eddie a promise before they shipped out. He had written to Eddie's mother, Ruth, without Eddie knowing. Ray had told Ruth McGuire that he would look after her son, that he would make sure Eddie came home, that Ruth had already lost her husband to the sea, and Ray Pelletier was not going to let the war take her son. Eddie found out about the letter 3 months later, when his mother wrote back mentioning what a nice young man Raymond was and how it made her feel better knowing someone was watching out for her. Eddie had confronted Ray. "You wrote my mother?" Ray shrugged. "She worries about you. All mothers worry. Mine worries about me. Yours worries about you. I told her I'd keep you safe. It's a promise. I keep my promises." Eddie looked at his friend. Ray was 20 years old, 5'7", maybe 145 pounds. A shoe factory kid from Lewiston who had never been in a fight in his life. Who was going to keep whom safe was an open question, but the gesture mattered. The promise mattered. They carried each other's letters the way soldiers do. If I don't make it, get this to Louise. If I don't make it, get this to my mother. The ordinary, devastating arrangement that young men make when they are far from home and surrounded by death. Then came December 16th, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge began in the pre-dawn darkness with the sound of 1,000 German artillery pieces opening fire simultaneously across a 60-mile front. The noise was unlike anything Eddie had ever heard. Not the crack of individual guns, but a continuous rolling thunder that shook the ground and filled the air with the physical pressure that you felt in your chest and your teeth. The 106th Infantry Division was positioned in the Schnee Eifel, a forested ridge in eastern Belgium that had been considered a quiet sector. The division had been there for 5 days. Most of the soldiers had never seen combat. They were green troops in a supposedly safe position, and on the morning of December 16th, 3 German divisions hit them with everything they had. What followed was one of the worst disasters in American military history. Within 48 hours, 2 entire regiments of the 106th, more than 8,000 men, were surrounded and forced to surrender. It was the largest mass surrender of American troops since the Civil War. Eddie and Ray were in the headquarters company, which was positioned behind the frontline regiments. When the attack began, the headquarters personnel were ordered to fall back to move west, toward the town of St. Vith, where American forces were attempting to establish a defensive line. The retreat was chaos. Units mixed together. Communications broke down. German patrols appeared on roads that were supposed to be safely behind American lines. Artillery fell without warning. Trucks were abandoned. Equipment was scattered. Men who had been sitting in warm buildings typing reports 12 hours earlier were suddenly stumbling through frozen forests with German tanks behind them and German paratroopers ahead of them. On the second day of the retreat, December 17th, Eddie and Ray were part of a column of mixed headquarters and support personnel moving west on a forest road when German machine gun fire opened up from the trees to the north. The ambush was quick and brutal. Men fell. Others dove for cover. Some ran. The column dissolved into individual men trying to survive a situation they had never trained for. Eddie grabbed Ray and pulled him behind an overturned supply truck. Bullets punched through the canvas and ricocheted off the frame with sharp metallic whines. Somewhere behind them, a man was screaming for a medic. The M1 carbine in Eddie's hands felt absurdly small. He had never fired it at a human being. He had fired it at paper targets during basic training and at tin cans behind the headquarters building in France when he was bored. He had always been accurate, the kind of natural accuracy that came from a lifetime of reading distance and wind over water. But accuracy at a firing range and accuracy in combat were different things. Ray was bleeding. A bullet had caught the outside of his left arm, cutting a groove through the flesh of his bicep that bled freely but wasn't deep enough to hit the bone or the artery. Ray was pressing his right hand against the wound, his face white with shock, eyes wide. "Eddie, I'm hit. I know. Let me see it." Eddie looked at the wound. Messy but survivable if they could stop the bleeding and get Ray to a medic. "Hold pressure on it. Don't let go. What's happening? Are we surrounded?" "I don't know. Just hold pressure. Stay behind the truck. Don't move." Eddie peered around the end of the truck. The German fire was coming from a tree line about 200 yards to the north. He could see muzzle flashes 3 or 4 positions, probably a patrol that had stumbled onto the American column or been waiting for it. An officer, a lieutenant Eddie didn't recognize, was trying to organize a return fire from the ditch on the south side of the road. Men were shooting back, but without coordination, without any clear target picture, just firing in the general direction of the Germans and hoping. Eddie raised his carbine. Through the basic iron sights, the tree line was a blur of dark shapes at 200 yards. He couldn't see individual Germans. He couldn't even tell which trees the fire was coming from. The muzzle flashes were there and gone brief winks of light that disappeared before you could aim at them. But Eddie could see something else. He could see the way the branches were moving at the top of certain trees. Not from wind, from men climbing. German soldiers were repositioning, moving through the tree line to flank the American column, and their movement was shaking branches in a pattern that was different from the natural sway of the forest. Thomas Maguire had taught his son to read the surface of the water for signs of fish moving underneath. The same skill applied to reading a forest. The natural movement of trees and wind has a rhythm, a pattern that repeats. When something disrupts that pattern, something alive, something with purpose, the disruption creates a signature that a trained eye can read. Eddie saw two Germans moving through the trees perhaps 50 yards apart. They were heading east, trying to get around the American flank. If they succeeded, they would have a clear line of fire on the ditch where the lieutenant was organizing his men. Eddie aimed at the leftmost movement. 200 yards. The carbine's effective range barely. He took a breath, let half of it out the way he had learned to do when waiting for the net throw, when his father would say, "Not yet. Not yet now." He squeezed the trigger. The carbine cracked. The movement in the trees stopped. He didn't know if he had hit the man or just stopped his advance. He shifted right, found the second movement pattern, fired again. The branch shaking stopped. The German fire slackened. Not because Eddie had destroyed the ambush, but because his two shots at the flanking element had disrupted the German plan enough that their patrol pulled back into the forest and disappeared. The column reformed. The wounded were collected. Ray was bandaged by a medic who told him the arm would be fine if they could get him to a field hospital within 24 hours. Infection was the danger, not the wound itself. Eddie helped Ray walk. They moved west with what was left of the column, and by evening they had reached the outskirts of St. Vith, where the 7th Armored Division and fragments of other units were forming a defensive perimeter. The next morning, Ray was evacuated to a field hospital. Eddie stood by the ambulance holding his friend's good hand. Ray's face was gray with pain and exhaustion. "Eddie, I promised your mother I'd keep you safe. Some promise. I can't even keep myself in one piece. You kept it. We're both alive. I'm going to a hospital. You're staying here. Who's going to watch out for you now? I'll manage. You just get that arm fixed." Ray gripped Eddie's hand tighter. "Eddie, listen. I heard what happened at the ambush. The guys in the column said you saw the Germans moving in the trees when nobody else could. Said you shot at 200 yards with the carbine and stopped a flanking attack. I got lucky. That wasn't luck. That was you. That was fishing. You were reading the trees the way your dad taught you to read the water." Eddie said nothing. He hadn't thought of it that way, but Ray was right. He had been reading the forest. "Listen to me." Ray's eyes were intense despite the pain. "You've got something, Eddie. Something they didn't teach you at Fort Benning. Something the Army doesn't know you have. Don't waste it. Whatever happens, don't waste what your father gave you." The ambulance pulled away. Eddie watched it disappear down the road to the west, carrying his best friend towards safety. He stood there for a long time in the cold, holding his carbine, thinking about what Ray had said. Don't waste what your father gave you. He wouldn't. But he didn't know yet what that meant. 2 days later, the German sniper appeared on the eastern ridge, and Eddie Maguire began to understand exactly what his father had given him. The sniper's first kill was a lieutenant named David Walker, 26 years old, from Columbus, Ohio. Walker was standing behind a stone wall studying a map with his platoon sergeant when the bullet came through the gap between two stones and hit him in the neck. He died in about 40 seconds, which is a long time when you are watching it happen. The second kill, 3 hours later, was a medic named Corporal James Wu, who had been crossing an open area between two buildings to reach a wounded soldier. Wu was wearing a Red Cross armband. The Geneva Convention said that made him a protected person. The bullet hit him in the chest and he fell in the middle of the street and lay there for 2 hours because nobody could reach him without being shot. By the end of the first day, 4 Americans were dead. All from single shots. All from the eastern ridge approximately 800 to 1,000 yards away. All precision. All patient. 1 round, 1 kill. The company commander, Captain Harold Stern, a 35-year-old lawyer from Brooklyn, who had been practicing criminal defense 6 months ago and was now responsible for the lives of 180 men, called a meeting of his NCOs and officers on the evening of December 17th. Stern was a smart man who knew the limits of his military expertise, which were considerable. He had been a reserve officer called to active duty, given a company of support troops, and thrown into the worst battle of the European War. He was doing his best, which wasn't nothing, But it wasn't enough to solve the sniper problem. That ridge is killing us. Stern pointed to the eastern tree line on a hand-drawn map. We've lost 4 men today, all from the same general direction. Range is too far for our weapons to reach. I've requested artillery support, but division says they have no batteries available. Everything is committed to the main line. One of the sergeants, a regular army man named Frank Novak from Pittsburgh, spoke up. Sir, what about our own snipers? We don't have snipers. Stern's voice was flat. We're a headquarters company reinforced with stragglers from 3 different units. Nobody in this position has sniper training or sniper weapons. We have M1 rifles, carbines, and 1 BAR, none of which can reach that ridge with any accuracy. What about moving a patrol up to the ridge, clear it ourselves? Through 800 yards of open ground with a sniper watching. That's a death march. He'd pick off the patrol before they got halfway. The room was silent. Eddie sat in the back listening. He had been assigned to the defensive perimeter as a rifleman, his headquarters clerk job irrelevant now that headquarters didn't exist anymore. He carried his carbine and did what he was told, and tried not to think about how inadequate the weapon was for what they were facing. After the meeting broke up, Eddie stayed behind. Captain Stern was rolling up the map looking like a man who had been given a problem with no solution and was being asked to solve it anyway. Sir, can I ask you something? What is it, McGuire, the sniper on the ridge? What's the exact range? Stern looked at him. Best estimate is 800 to 1,000 yards, depending on which position he's firing from. Why? What if we could put a scope on a weapon and engage him from here? Stern's expression was patient, the way a lawyer looks at a client who is about to suggest something legally creative. McGuire, even if we had a scope, which we don't, the M1 Garand's effective range against a point target is about 500 yards. The carbine is less than half that. A scope doesn't change the ballistics of the ammunition. It just lets you see what you're missing. I understand that, sir, but the carbine round has more range than the manual says. The manual talks about effective range, which means the range where the average soldier can reliably hit a man-sized target. That's not the same as maximum range. The bullet still travels past the effective range. It just drops more and drifts more. If you know how much it drops and how much it drifts, you can compensate. Stern studied the young corporal. You sound like you've thought about this. Eddie hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain what he was thinking without sounding like a fool. Sir, I grew up fishing in Maine. My father taught me to read wind and distance over water. A bullet isn't that different from a sinker on a line. They both follow physics. They both drop at predictable rates. If I can see the target clearly and calculate the drop, I can put a round on it. With a carbine, at 800 yards. Maybe more. The .30 carbine round leaves the muzzle at about 1,900 feet per second. It's slow compared to a rifle round, but it's still moving. At 800 yards, the drop would be significant, maybe 30 feet below line of sight. But if I aim 30 feet above the target and the wind is accounted for, the bullet goes where physics says it goes. Stern was quiet for a moment. McGuire, I appreciate the thinking. But even if the ballistics are theoretically possible, you can't aim 30 feet above a target with iron sights and have any idea where the bullet is going to land. You need optics for that kind of shooting. Yes, sir. That's the other thing I wanted to talk about. I found a scope. Where? In a ditch. 2 days ago during the retreat. A Springfield sniper rifle that had been run over by a truck. The rifle is destroyed, bent barrel, cracked stock, useless. But the scope survived. It's a Weaver 3304 power. Lens is intact. The mount is damaged, but the optic itself works. Stern leaned forward. And you want to mount it on your carbine? Yes, sir. The M1 carbine has no provision for scope mounting. The receiver isn't machined for it. There's no mounting rail, no threaded holes, no hardware. You can't attach a scope to a carbine. Eddie reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a spool of clear monofilament fishing line. 60-pound test. He set it on the table next to the scope he had brought with him, a steel tube about 9 inches long with scratches on the housing, but clear glass when you looked through it. You can if you know how to tie the right knots. Stern stared at the spool of fishing line and the battered scope, and the earnest young man from Maine who was proposing to build a sniper weapon from a clerk's carbine, a broken scope, and a spool of fishing wire. Then he did what every officer in every one of these stories does when confronted with something that isn't in any manual. He shook his head. McGuire, that's the most creative and the most insane idea I've heard since I put on this uniform. Sir, I know it sounds crazy. It doesn't sound crazy. It sounds impossible. And I don't have the authority to approve untested weapon modifications. If that scope comes loose during firing and hits you in the face, I'm responsible. Sir, men are dying. 4 today. Tomorrow it'll be more. That sniper has our range and our position, and we can't touch him. We can't move because we're holding this line. We can't call artillery because there's no artillery. We can't send a patrol because he'll kill them in the open. Eddie's voice was steady but urgent. The only option is to shoot back. And the only way to shoot back at that range is with the scope. I can mount this scope on my carbine using monofilament wrapping. I've been tying connections that hold against North Atlantic currents since I was 7 years old. The wrapping will hold. The scope will stay zeroed. And I can make that shot. Stern picked up the spool of fishing line, turned it over in his hands. This holds up a 1,000-pound lobster trap in rough seas. Yes, sir. Properly wrapped and seated. 60-pound monofilament creates a binding that absorbs vibration rather than transmitting it. That's actually an advantage for scope mounting. A rigid metal mount transmits recoil shock directly to the scope, which can shift the zero over time. A monofilament wrap absorbs the recoil energy and returns the scope to its original position. In theory, it's actually more stable than a metal mount for precision shooting. In theory. In practice, too. My father used the same principle to mount instruments on the boat. Compass, depth finder, anything that needed to stay steady in rough water. Metal mounts vibrated loose. Monofilament wraps stayed put. Stern was quiet for a long time. He looked at the scope at the fishing line at Eddie. He thought about 4 dead Americans and the 11 more who would die tomorrow and the day after that, unless something changed. McGuire, if this doesn't work, if that scope comes off and you get hurt, I never gave you permission. You did this on your own. Are we clear? Crystal clear, sir. Stern hesitated one more moment. Then he said the words that Eddie would remember for the rest of his life. One more thing, McGuire. Don't miss. Eddie took the scope and the fishing line back to his foxhole and began building a weapon that every weapons manual said couldn't exist. The work took most of the night. Eddie started by cleaning the scope. The Weaver TV-0 was a simple rugged optic. 4-power magnification crosshair reticle about 9 inches long and weighing just under a pound. The adjustment turrets for windage and elevation were stiff from cold and dirt, but they turned. The lenses were clear. The crosshairs were intact. The mounting was the problem. The M1 carbine's receiver was a smooth, rounded piece of machined steel with no flat surfaces designed for scope attachment. There were no dovetails, no mounting holes, no rails. The weapon had been designed for close range work, where iron sights were sufficient, and nobody at Winchester or the Springfield Armory had ever imagined that someone would try to turn it into a long-range precision rifle. Eddie studied the receiver by candlelight, turning the carbine over in his hands, looking for points where a scope could sit without interfering with the action. The bolt handle moved on the right side of the receiver, which meant the scope had to be offset to the left or mounted high enough that the bolt could cycle underneath it. He chose a high mount. The scope would sit directly above the barrel, raised about an inch above the receiver surface. This would create a height over bore issue, meaning the scope's line of sight would be above the barrel's axis, which would affect his calculations at extreme range. But it was the only configuration that allowed the bolt to function normally. The question was how to hold the scope in place. A metal mount would require drilling and tapping holes in the receiver, which Eddie didn't have tools for. Even if he did, drilling into the receiver might weaken it enough to cause a catastrophic failure when the weapon fired. The receiver was the structural heart of the weapon. You didn't put holes in it unless you were an armorer with the right equipment and the right training. Eddie had neither. What he had was 60-pound test monofilament fishing line and 20 years of tying knots that held against the North Atlantic. He began by creating a base. He took 2 brass shell casings from spent .30 caliber rounds and, using his trench knife as an improvised metalworking tool, flattened them into small rectangular pads about the size of his thumbnail. These pads would sit between the scope and the receiver, creating a raised platform and a friction surface that the monofilament could grip. He positioned the brass pads on the receiver, one near the front ring of the scope mount and one near the rear. Then he began wrapping. The technique was the same one his father had used to lash instruments to the Mary Ellen's cabin top. Start with the foundation wrap. 12 tight turns of monofilament, each one seated precisely against the previous one, creating a flat bed of line that distributed the clamping force evenly. Then a cross-wrap figure 8 pattern pulling the scope body down against the brass pads, and the brass pads down against the receiver. Then another foundation wrap on top, locking the cross-wrap in place. Each layer had to be under consistent tension. Too loose, and the scope would shift. Too tight, and the monofilament would cut into itself and weaken. The right tension was something Eddie could feel in his fingers, the way a musician feels the right tuning of a string. It was a physical knowledge that had been trained into his hands since childhood. He worked slowly. The candlelight flickered, making shadows dance on the walls of the foxhole. His fingers were numb from the cold. The monofilament was stiff in the December air, harder to work than it would have been in a Maine summer, but it was still monofilament. It still behaved the way monofilament always behaved, and Eddie knew its behavior the way he knew his own breathing. The front mount took 45 minutes, 36 individual wraps, each one checked by touch before the next one was laid down. When he was done, the scope's front ring was held to the receiver by a web of transparent line that looked fragile, but was in fact capable of holding several hundred pounds of force. The rear mount took another 40 minutes. Same technique, same patience, same obsessive attention to each individual wrap. When both mounts were complete, Eddie tested the installation. He grabbed the scope and tried to move it, pushed it left, right, up, down, applied force from every angle. The scope did not move. The monofilament held it as firmly as if it had been bolted in place. Then he did something that would have horrified any armorer who saw it. He held the carbine by the scope and shook the entire weapon violently, slammed the stock against the wall of the foxhole, dropped it on the frozen ground from waist height. The scope didn't shift. The monofilament absorbed each impact, flexing microscopically and then returning to its original position exactly the way it absorbed wave action on a lobster trap rig. Every shock was dampened. Every vibration was eaten. Eddie picked up the weapon and looked through the scope. The reticle was steady. The image was clear. 4-power magnification turned the dark tree line on the eastern ridge from a vague mass of shadows into individual trees with visible branches and visible gaps between them. He couldn't zero the scope in the dark. That would have to wait for morning. But he could begin the ballistic calculations. He pulled out a small notebook and a pencil stub and began working the math by candlelight. The .30 carbine round had a muzzle velocity of approximately 1,900 feet per second. The bullet weighed 110 grains. Using the basic ballistic formulas he had memorized from the Army Field Manual, supplemented by his own understanding of projectile behavior from years of watching sinkers and lures fly through the air over Penobscot Bay, he calculated the trajectory. At 800 yards, the bullet would take approximately 1.8 seconds to reach the target. During that time, gravity would pull it down approximately 28 feet below the line of sight. In a 10-mile-per-hour crosswind, the bullet would drift laterally about 6 feet. Those were enormous numbers. At 800 yards with a proper sniper rifle firing a high-velocity round, the drop might be 8 or 9 feet. The .30 carbine round dropped more than 3 times as much because it was slower and lighter. The margin for error was vanishingly small, but the numbers were numbers. They were physics. They were as predictable as the tide tables his father had used to plan fishing trips. If Eddie knew the range, the wind, and the temperature, he could calculate exactly where the bullet would go. The bullet didn't care that it was fired from a carbine instead of a Springfield. It obeyed the same laws either way. The question was whether Eddie could aim precisely enough to exploit those calculations. And that was where the scope mattered. With iron sights aiming 28 feet above a man-sized target at 800 yards was pure guesswork. With 4-power magnification and crosshairs, it was geometry. Eddie wrote the numbers on the back of a ration box. Drop at 600 yards, drop at 700, drop at 800, drop at 900 and 1,000 because the sniper might be farther than he estimated. Wind drift corrections for 5, 10, and 15-mile-per-hour crosswinds. He created a range card crude, but functional the same way any sniper would create a range card for a new position. Except no sniper in the United States Army had ever created a range card for an M1 carbine. Because no sniper in the United States Army had ever tried to use an M1 carbine as a precision weapon at distances that exceeded its theoretical capabilities by a factor of 4. By the time Eddie finished his calculations, the first gray light of dawn was showing above the eastern ridge. The ridge where the German sniper was waking up, checking his weapon, preparing for another day of methodical killing. Eddie looked at the carbine with its fishing wire scope mount and its hand-drawn range card and its pistol-caliber ammunition that the Army said was effective to 200 yards. He thought about his father standing on the deck of the Mary Ellen waiting for the fish to be exactly. Ellen waiting for the fish to be exactly right before throwing the net. One throw. One net. One moment of total commitment. He thought about Ray Pelletier, somewhere in a field hospital, who had told him not to waste what his father had given him. He thought about the 4 dead Americans and the ones who would die today if nothing changed. Then he shouldered the weapon, put his eye to the scope, and began to learn what a carbine could actually do when a fisherman's son asked it the right question. The first shot was a disaster. Eddie had positioned himself behind a low stone wall on the western edge of the defensive perimeter about 50 yards back from the forward positions where the sniper had been picking off Americans for 3 days. The wall gave him solid support for the carbine, and the slightly elevated position offered a clear line of sight to the eastern ridge. Through the scope at 4-power magnification, the tree line was transformed. What had been an anonymous mass of dark evergreen and bare deciduous branches became a detailed landscape of individual trees, rock outcroppings, and shadow patterns. Eddie could see the specific areas where the sniper's shots had originated, identifiable by the subtle sightline corridors between the trees where a shooter could see the American positions below. He chose a target for his first shot. Not the sniper. Not yet. He needed to zero the scope first to confirm that his calculations were correct and that the monofilament mount was holding true. He chose a distinctive rock formation on the face of the ridge, a light-colored limestone outcrop about the size of a man's torso, clearly visible against the darker background. He estimated the range at 600 yards. According to his range card, the bullet would drop approximately 14 feet at that distance. He placed the crosshairs 14 feet above the rock, adjusted slightly left for what he estimated was a 5-mile-per-hour wind from the right, took a breath, released half of it, and squeezed the trigger. The carbine cracked. The report was sharp and brief. Nothing like the deeper bark of an M1 Garand or the heavy concussion of a BAR. Through the scope, Eddie watched for the impact. He saw nothing. No spray of rock dust. No mark on the limestone. No indication that the bullet had gone anywhere near the target. It had missed completely, and at 600 yards he had no way to know by how much or in which direction. Sergeant Frank Novak, who had been watching from a nearby position with binoculars, crawled over. "McGuire, what the hell are you doing? You're zeroing the scope, Sergeant." "Zeroing what scope?" Novak looked at the carbine. His face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, recognition, and disbelief. "Is that a rifle scope tied to your carbine with fishing line?" "Yes, Sergeant." Novak stared at the weapon. The monofilament wrapping was nearly invisible against the dark metal of the receiver, but the scope itself was impossible to miss a steel tube sitting on top of a carbine that was never designed to carry one. Does Captain Stern know about this? He knows, and he approved it. He didn't disapprove it. Novak's expression settled into something between amusement and pity. "McGuire, the carbine can't shoot 600 yards. The round doesn't have the energy. You're wasting ammunition. The round has the energy, Sergeant. It's just slow. I need to figure out the holdover." Eddie fired again. Same aiming point, same calculations, but this time he adjusted his estimated range upward to 650 yards, increasing the holdover to 17 feet. Again, nothing. No visible impact. By this time, a small group of soldiers had gathered. Word travels in a foxhole the way word always travels in foxholes, through the whisper network of bored and frightened men looking for anything that breaks the monotony of waiting to be shot at. "Hey, the headquarters clerk is trying to shoot a German sniper with a fishing pole attached to his carbine." The laughter started. Not cruel exactly, but the kind of laughter that men direct at someone doing something transparently foolish. The fisherman from Maine thinks he's a sniper. The clerk with the typewriter thinks his carbine is a Springfield. One soldier, a rifleman from the 422nd Infantry, who had been absorbed into Stern's makeshift company after the surrender, was less kind. "That's an M1 carbine genius. It shoots pistol rounds. You couldn't hit that ridge with 100 shots. Go back to typing reports and leave the fighting to people with real weapons." Eddie didn't respond. He was recalculating. 2 misses at what he estimated was 600 to 650 yards. Either his range estimate was wrong, or his ballistic calculations were off, or both. He needed a reference point, something at a known distance that he could shoot at and observe the impact. He scanned the terrain between his position and the ridge. Halfway across the open ground approximately 400 yards out, there was a burned-out German truck sitting at the edge of a drainage ditch. He could see it clearly through the scope. He aimed at the truck's cab. At 400 yards, his calculated drop was 6 feet. He aimed 6 feet above the roof of the cab and fired. Through the scope, he saw a puff of rust and dirt kick up from the hood of the truck. Low and left. About 3 feet low, 2 feet left. Now he had data. The bullet had hit lower than expected, which meant either his muzzle velocity estimate was too high or the drag coefficient of the .30 carbine bullet was greater than the standard tables indicated. The leftward drift meant his wind call was off or the scope wasn't perfectly aligned. He adjusted, cranked the elevation turret up 4 clicks, 2 clicks right on the windage, fired again at the truck. This time the bullet hit the cab roof exactly where he had aimed. A small hole appeared in the rusted metal visible through the scope as a dark circle against the faded olive paint. Eddie exhaled. The scope was holding. The monofilament mount was absorbing the recoil without shifting the zero. The ballistic corrections were working once he had real data to calibrate against. But 400 yards was barely half the distance to the ridge, and the .30 carbine round was losing velocity rapidly at that range. Every additional 100 yards would increase the drop exponentially and amplify any error in his wind reading. Novak was still watching. He had seen the truck hit. His expression had changed. "You actually hit that truck." "Yes, Sergeant. That's 400 yards. With the carbine." "The bullet goes where physics says it goes, Sergeant. The carbine is just the launching system. The physics are the same for any projectile." Novak was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised Eddie. "Can you reach the ridge? I don't know yet. I need more data at longer ranges. But I'm going to find out." Over the next hour, Eddie fired 12 more rounds. He used terrain features at increasing distances as reference targets: a fence post at 500 yards, a damaged tree at 600, a rock face at 700. Each shot gave him data. Each data point refined his range card. Each correction brought his calculations closer to the reality of how the .30 carbine bullet actually behaved at distances the Army said it couldn't reach. The soldiers who had laughed were no longer laughing. They were watching. Some with skepticism, some with growing interest, some with the particular intensity of men who were watching their only chance of surviving the next day being assembled from fishing wire and stubbornness. By the time Eddie had finished his zeroing process, he had a revised range card that covered every 50-yard increment from 400 to 1,000 yards. The numbers were extraordinary. At 800 yards, the .30 carbine bullet dropped 32 feet below line of sight. At 1,000 yards, it dropped 54 feet. The wind drift was measured in yards, not inches, but the numbers were consistent. The bullet was following a predictable curve, and Eddie could calculate that curve with enough precision to put a round within 2 feet of its intended impact point at 800 yards. 2 feet wasn't match-grade accuracy. It wasn't what a trained sniper with a proper rifle could achieve, but it was enough. A man's torso is about 18 inches wide. 2 feet of accuracy gave Eddie a margin of 6 inches on either side. Tight, but workable. If the scope held, if the monofilament didn't stretch in the cold, if the wind didn't shift between the time he read it and the time the bullet arrived 1.8 seconds later. If. Captain Stern came to Eddie's position at noon. He looked at the carbine at the scope at the range card scratched onto the back of a ration box. He looked at the group of soldiers who had gathered, no longer laughing, watching Eddie with something that was trying to become hope. "McGuire, report." "Sir, the scope mount is holding. I've zeroed at multiple distances out to 700 yards confirmed. I have a range card for the ridge positions. The ballistics are extreme but calculable. Can you make the shot?" Eddie thought about his father. One throw, one net. One moment of total commitment backed by hours of careful reading. "I can make the shot, sir, but I need the sniper to show himself. One shot, one opportunity. If I miss, he'll know we have a weapon that can reach him, and he'll relocate to a position I haven't mapped." Stern nodded. He understood the tactical reality. "You get one chance, McGuire. Make it count." Eddie settled behind his carbine with its fishing wire scope mount and waited for the German sniper to make a mistake. The patience of a fisherman's son, trained since childhood to wait for the right moment, settled into his bones like cold water. He was ready. The question was whether the German was ready for something he couldn't possibly expect. A carbine round arriving from a weapon that shouldn't have been able to send it. The German sniper's name was Feldwebel Klaus Brandt. And he was 31 years old, and he was very good at killing Americans. He had grown up in the Harz Mountains in central Germany, in a family of foresters who had managed the same tract of woodland since his grandfather's time. The Harz was a landscape of dense spruce forest, steep valleys, and weather that changed without warning. It was a landscape that taught patience and precision to anyone who lived in it long enough. Klaus had been hunting since he could carry a rifle, which in his family meant age 10. His father Wilhelm was a man of few words and exacting standards, who believed that a hunter who needed 2 shots was a hunter who hadn't prepared for one. Wilhelm taught his son to read the forest the way Thomas Maguire taught his son to read the sea. Where does the wind blow at this hour? Where does the shadow fall? Where does the deer go when the weather changes? Different worlds, different elements, the same lesson. Understand the environment completely, then commit to a single moment of action. Klaus had been drafted in 1940 and identified as a marksman during basic training. The German army was methodical about this. Every recruit was tested, and the ones who showed exceptional accuracy were offered specialized training. Klaus accepted because shooting was the one military skill that felt natural to him. Everything else about the army, the formations, the saluting, the mindless obedience, chafed against his forester's independence. But shooting was just hunting, and Klaus Brandt was an excellent hunter. He had fought on the Eastern Front for 2 years before being transferred west in the fall of 1944, part of the buildup for what would become the Ardennes Offensive. The Eastern Front had taught him things that no training manual could teach. It had taught him that patience was a weapon, that cold was a weapon, that the space between 2 heartbeats was a weapon. It had taught him that the most dangerous enemy was not the one you could see, but the one you couldn't. On the ridge above the American defensive position, Klaus Brandt had established himself with professional thoroughness. He had 3 firing positions prepared in the tree line, each offering different angles on the American perimeter below. He rotated between them on an unpredictable schedule, never firing from the same position twice in succession, never establishing a pattern that could be predicted. His weapon was a Carabiner 98K, with a ZF-41 scope, a 1.5 power optic, that was considered inadequate by many German snipers, but that Klaus preferred for its wide field of view and its ruggedness. He had killed more than 40 men with that combination across 3 years of war, and he trusted it the way a craftsman trusts his tools. He knew the American positions. He had mapped them mentally during his first 12 hours on the ridge, identifying firing lanes, dead zones, movement corridors, and the specific locations where Americans exposed themselves most frequently. He knew their routines. He knew that they moved between buildings on the hour, that they changed sentries at predictable intervals, that the command post was in the stone building on the west end of the village. And he knew with the certainty of a professional who understood his enemy's equipment that nothing the Americans had could reach him. 800 yards was beyond the effective range of the M1 Garand. It was far beyond the range of the M1 carbine. Even the BAR, which was the heaviest weapon visible in the American position, was an area weapon, not a precision instrument. He was safe. He was invisible. He was methodically destroying the American ability to function in their own defensive position, one man at a time. On the morning of December 20th, the 4th day of his operation, Klaus Brandt settled into his primary firing position, a shallow depression between 2 spruce trees that offered a clear view of the American perimeter through a narrow corridor in the canopy. He checked his weapon, cleaned the scope lenses with a soft cloth, loaded 5 rounds, and began scanning for targets. At 1,400 yards from his position behind a stone wall that he had cataloged as position 7 in his mental map, something caught his attention. A brief flash of light. Not a muzzle flash. Something else. The morning sun reflecting off glass. A lens. Klaus studied the position through his scope. He could see the stone wall clearly at 1.5 power. He could see movement behind it. A man partially concealed doing something with his hands. The flash had come from whatever the man was holding. Binoculars, probably. An American officer studying the ridge trying to spot Klaus's position. It happened every day. They looked, they studied, they pointed at the tree line, and then they went away frustrated because they could never pinpoint him precisely enough to do anything about it. Klaus was not concerned. He was at 1,400 yards from position 7, well beyond the range of anything the Americans had. The man with the binoculars was not a threat. He was a potential target. Klaus made a note of the position and continued scanning for closer, more immediate opportunities. He found one at 9:42 in the morning. An American soldier carrying a box of ammunition crossing between 2 buildings at approximately 850 yards. The man was moving, but he had to cross about 15 yards of open ground, which at walking pace would take approximately 4 seconds. Klaus calculated 850 yards, 1.3 seconds of flight time for the 7.92mm round. The man was moving left to right at perhaps 3 miles per hour. Lead the target by approximately 4 feet. He settled the crosshairs, breathed, waited for the natural pause between heartbeats. Squeezed the trigger. The American dropped the ammunition box and fell sideways, crumpling against the wall of the building he had been walking toward. He didn't get up. Kill number 12. Klaus worked the bolt, chambered a fresh round, and waited for the Americans to expose themselves, trying to recover their comrade. They always did, and they always provided him with additional targets in the process. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that 1,400 yards to the west, a fisherman's son from Maine had watched the muzzle flash through a 4-power scope mounted on an M1 carbine with fishing wire, and the fisherman's son had just written a new number on his range card, 1,400 yards. Eddie had seen the shot. More importantly, he had seen the flash. Through the scope at 4-power magnification, the muzzle flash from the German's position had been a brief bright wink of light in the tree line, visible for perhaps a quarter of a second. It came from a position that Eddie hadn't identified before, higher on the ridge than the spots he had been watching, set back in the trees at a slight angle that explained why previous attempts to locate the sniper had failed. He marked the position on his range card. Estimated range 1,400 yards. His fingers went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. 1,400 yards. His range card only went to 1,000. He hadn't calculated beyond that because he hadn't believed the engagement would require it. 800 to 1,000 yards was already insane for a carbine. 1,400 yards was something else entirely. It was a distance where the .30 carbine bullet would be traveling at barely subsonic speeds, where the drop would be measured in dozens of feet, where wind drift could push the round yards off target. He pulled out his notebook and started calculating. The numbers were staggering. At 1,400 yards, flight time approximately 3.2 seconds. Drop below line of sight approximately 90 feet. 90 feet. He would have to aim at a point in the sky that was 30 yards above the target. Any error in his range estimate of even 50 yards would move the impact by 8 to 10 feet. Any unaccounted wind would push the bullet even farther. The math said it was barely possible. The physics said the bullet would arrive with enough energy to kill if it hit. The practical reality said that making this shot with this weapon from this distance was the equivalent of throwing a stone across a football field and hitting a dinner plate. But the alternative was watching more Americans die. One at a time, every day, until the German ran out of targets or the Americans ran out of men. Eddie spent the rest of the day preparing. He didn't fire. He didn't want to alert the sniper that someone was watching him. Instead, he observed. He used the scope to study the German's position for hours, noting every detail he could see at 4-power magnification from 1,400 yards. The sniper was using a depression between 2 spruce trees. The trees were approximately 15 feet apart, creating a natural window through the canopy. The depression was shallow, maybe 2 feet below the surrounding ground level, which meant the sniper was shooting from a slightly downward angle. Eddie could see, or thought he could see, the occasional movement of a human shape in the shadows between the trees. Not clear enough to aim at. Not consistent enough to predict, but present. The sniper was there, and he would be there again tomorrow. Eddie studied the wind. This was where Thomas Maguire's fishing lessons became a weapon. Wind over open ground behaves in patterns. It follows terrain features, channeling through valleys, swirling around obstacles, creating eddies and corridors that are predictable if you understand the landscape. Eddie watched how the grass moved in the fields between his position and the ridge. He watched how the snow crystals shifted on exposed rock faces. He watched how the tree branches swayed at different heights, noting that the wind near the ground was lighter than the wind at treetop height, which meant the bullet would pass through different wind conditions at different points in its trajectory. He built a wind map in his notebook. Wind speed and direction at ground level estimated from grass movement. Wind speed at 20 feet estimated from flag behavior on a damaged building. Wind speed at treetop height estimated from branch sway. The bullet would travel through all 3 zones during its 3.2-second flight. By evening, Eddie had a complete firing solution. Range 1,400 yards, drop 90 feet. Wind correction 14 feet right to left based on his best estimate of the integrated wind effect across the entire flight path. Total hold aim 90 feet above and 14 feet to the left of the target. He showed the numbers to Novak, who looked at them, and then looked at Eddie with an expression that mixed respect with something close to horror. 90 feet of holdover. You're going to aim at the sky and hope the bullet falls on a man a mile away. Not hope. Calculate. The bullet goes where physics says it goes. McGuire, that's a margin of error measured in body lengths. If your range is off by 50 yards, you miss by 10 feet. If the wind shifts during the flight time, you miss by 15 feet. I know. Eddie's voice was steady. That's why I get one shot. If I miss, he relocates. If I hit, the problem is solved. One throw of the net, Sergeant. That's all I've ever needed. Novak was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that Eddie hadn't expected. My grandfather was a fisherman. Lake Erie. He always said the same thing your father said. You don't throw until you know. Then you throw everything. Eddie looked at him. You believe I can make this shot? I believe you're the only person in this company crazy enough to try. And I believe that if you've done the math right, the math doesn't lie. Novak paused. But McGuire, what if the scope comes loose? What if the monofilament freezes and cracks? Eddie held up the carbine. In the dim light, the monofilament wrapping was almost invisible, a ghost binding holding a scope to a weapon that was never meant to carry one. The monofilament won't freeze. It's designed for cold water fishing in the North Atlantic. The glass transition temperature of nylon monofilament is well below what we're experiencing here. And the wrapping is seated under tension, which means even if individual strands fail, the remaining strands redistribute the load. He ran his thumb along the wrapping, feeling the taut, smooth surface of the line against the cold steel. My father tied knots that held against 1,000-pound loads in January seas. This will hold against the recoil of a carbine round. I'd bet my life on it. Novak looked at him evenly. You are betting your life on it. And 11 dead Americans are betting on you. Eddie nodded. He understood the weight. He felt it the way he had felt the weight of the net when his father handed it to him for the first time and said, Now you throw. Tomorrow morning, first light, when the sniper settles into his position and the light is behind me and in his eyes. Novak stood. I'll make sure nobody blocks your line of sight. And McGuire, I'll have binoculars on the target. If you hit, I'll confirm it. If I hit. When you hit. Novak's voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. Your father didn't raise a man who misses. Eddie watched the sergeant walk away into the frozen darkness. Then he settled into his position behind the stone wall, wrapped himself in his blanket, and waited for dawn. The carbine lay across his lap, the fishing wire scope mount cold against his hands. The range card tucked into his jacket pocket next to the letter from his mother that he carried everywhere. Somewhere on the ridge, 1,400 yards away, a German forester's son was doing the same thing. Waiting for morning, waiting for the light, waiting for the moment of commitment. One of them would not see the next sunset. Dawn came slowly on December 21st, 1944, the shortest day of the year. The sun rose behind the eastern ridge at 0823, throwing long shadows across the frozen valley and painting the snow-covered fields in shades of gold and gray. Eddie McGuire had been in position for 2 hours. He had not moved. He had not eaten. He had not allowed himself to shiver despite the cold that had seeped through his clothing and into his bones during the long, still hours before dawn. Shivering moved the weapon. Moving the weapon meant losing his sight picture. Losing his sight picture meant starting over. Thomas McGuire had taught him this too. On the boat in the dark, watching for the mackerel school, you didn't move. You didn't shift your weight. You didn't stamp your feet or blow on your hands or do any of the things that your body desperately wanted to do when it was cold and tired and had been still for too long. Because movement scared the fish. And scared fish didn't come within range. Eddie applied the same discipline to a stone wall in Belgium. The German sniper was the fish. The bullet was the net. And the moment of commitment was coming. Through the scope, Eddie watched the ridge. The morning light was moving down the slope, illuminating the tree line from above, creating a brief window when the shadows between the trees were partially lit, making it easier to see movement in the positions where the sniper had been operating. At 0847, he saw it. A shift in the shadows between the two spruce trees. A human-shaped darkness moving from right to left, settling into the depression he had identified the previous day. Then a brief glint. Glass. the sniper's own scope catching the morning light for just an instant before the man adjusted his position. The German was in his primary firing position, 1,400 yards away. Through the scope at 4 power, Eddie could see the general shape but not the details. A dark mass in a darker depression partially obscured by the branches of the spruce trees. He could see enough to know where the man's center of mass was. He could see enough to aim. Eddie's hands did not shake. They had stopped shaking an hour ago when the cold and the stillness and the focused attention had combined into a state that was beyond nervousness, beyond fear, into a place that was simply preparation. Every cell in his body was aligned toward a single purpose. He referenced his range card. 1,400 yards. Drop 90 feet. Wind correction. He checked the indicators he had been watching since before dawn. The grass in the field was bending slightly from the right, suggesting a 5 to 8 mile-per-hour crosswind. Less than yesterday. The snow crystals on the exposed rock faces were drifting in the same direction, confirming the reading. He revised his wind correction downward. 10 feet right to left instead of 14. The lighter wind was a gift. It reduced one of the largest variables in his equation. He placed the crosshairs on the sniper's position. Then he raised the muzzle. Up, far above the target, into the tree canopy, into the sky above the trees, 90 feet above the point where he wanted the bullet to land. The crosshair sat on a patch of gray morning sky that bore no visible relationship to the man he was trying to kill. This was the moment that tested everything. Every instinct Eddie McGuire possessed told him that aiming at the sky was wrong. His eyes said the target was down there in the trees and the weapon should be pointed at the trees. His training, such as it was, said you put the sights on the target and you squeeze the trigger. But the physics said the bullet would fall 90 feet during its 3.2-second flight. And Eddie McGuire, the son of a man who had understood the physics of the sea better than any professor trusted the physics. He adjusted 10 feet to the left to compensate for the crosswind. He took a breath. The air was cold and tasted of snow and pine and the distant smoke of burning buildings somewhere to the south. He released half the breath. His heartbeat slowed. The crosshairs steadied on the patch of sky that his calculations said was the right patch of sky. He thought about nothing. For one perfect moment, there was no war, no cold, no fear, no dead Americans, no German sniper, no fishing wire, no doubt. There was only the physics of the moment, the angle of the barrel, the weight of the trigger, the readiness of the hand. He squeezed. The carbine cracked. A sharp light report that was swallowed by the open air almost immediately. The recoil was minimal, the .30 carbine round producing a fraction of the kick a rifle round would generate. Through the scope, Eddie watched the sky above the target and saw nothing. There was nothing to see. The bullet was invisible, a 110-grain piece of lead copper, traveling through 1,400 yards of frozen Belgian air at a speed that had started as 1,900 feet per second and was dropping with every yard. 3.2 seconds. Eddie counted in his head. Not counting exactly, feeling the time pass. The way you feel the time pass between throwing the net and seeing whether it landed right. 1, 2, 3. On the ridge, something happened. Through the scope, Eddie saw a change in the shadow pattern between the spruce trees. The dark human shape that had been settled in the depression moved. Not deliberately, not with purpose. It slumped, sagged to one side, went still in a way that was different from the stillness of a man holding position. Novak's voice came from beside him, low and intense. The sergeant had his binoculars pressed to his face, elbows braced on the stone wall. I see movement. Target position. Something changed. I can't confirm a hit at this distance, but something changed. Eddie kept his eye on the scope. He didn't move. He didn't celebrate. He didn't do anything except watch and wait, because a man who was hit was not necessarily a man who was dead, and a wounded sniper was still a sniper. 5 minutes passed. The shape between the spruce trees did not move. No follow-up shot came from the ridge. No muzzle flash. No crack of a rifle reaching across the valley to punish the Americans for their exposure. 10 minutes. Still nothing. 15 minutes. A corporal named Danny Torres, who had been pinned behind a demolished truck for 2 hours the previous day by sniper fire, stood up slowly from his foxhole. He stood in the open, visible, exposed, exactly the kind of target the German had been killing for 4 days. Nothing happened. Torres stood there for 30 seconds. Then a minute. The longest minute of his life probably standing in the open where 5 men had died daring the ridge to prove that the nightmare wasn't over. No shot came. Novak lowered his binoculars. "I think you got him." Eddie's hands began to shake. Not from cold, from the sudden release of tension that had been holding his body rigid for hours. The trembling started in his fingers and moved up his arms and into his shoulders, and he had to set the carbine down on the stone wall because he couldn't trust himself to hold it. "I don't know. I can't confirm the hit. The range is too far to see the impact. The silence from the ridge is the confirmation, McGuire. 4 days, 12 dead Americans, and now nothing. You changed something." Eddie looked at the carbine lying on the wall. The fishing wire scope mount gleamed faintly in the morning light, the monofilament catching the sun the way it caught the sun on a lobster trap buoy in Penobscot Bay. The scope sat perfectly in its cradle of transparent line, undisturbed by the shot returned to its exact pre-fire position by the vibration-absorbing properties of the wrapping. It had held. His father's knots had held. 1,400 yards, 90 feet of drop, 3.2 seconds of flight time, and the fishing wire had held. Captain Stern arrived at the position 30 minutes later, moving with the cautious speed of a man who wasn't sure the sniper was actually gone. He looked at Eddie, at the carbine, at the scope, at the range card on the back of the ration box. "Report, McGuire." "Sir, I engaged the sniper position on the eastern ridge at approximately 0848 hours. Single shot range estimated 1,400 yards. Possible hit. No confirmed kill, but there has been no fire from the ridge since the engagement." Stern studied the ridge through his own binoculars. 1,400 yards. With a carbine? "Yes, sir." "That's 3/4 of a mile." "I know, sir." Stern lowered the binoculars. There was something in his face that Eddie had seen before in the faces of the men on the dock at Thomaston when Thomas McGuire brought in a catch that shouldn't have been possible. The expression of someone watching a man do something that the rules said couldn't be done. "McGuire, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Did you get lucky or can you do this again?" Eddie thought about the question. The honest answer was complicated. The shot had worked probably, but he didn't know exactly where the bullet had hit, or if it had hit the sniper directly, or struck close enough to wound or drive him from his position. He didn't know if the monofilament mount would hold up over repeated firings, or if it would slowly stretch and shift the zero. He didn't know a lot of things, but he knew the physics, and the physics hadn't changed. "Sir, I can do this again." The calculations worked. The mount held. The bullet went where the math said it would go. If I can see a target and calculate the range and the wind, I can engage it. The weapon is consistent. Even at 1,400 yards. Even at 1,400 yards. The .30 carbine round is still lethal at that range. It's slow, it drops a lot, and the wind affects it significantly. But if you account for all of those factors, it arrives with enough energy to kill. Stern made a decision. "McGuire, as of right now, you're reassigned from headquarters duties. You're this company's designated marksman. Your job is to provide long-range precision fire support from whatever position gives you the best sightlines." He paused. "And McGuire, I want you to teach other men how to do what you just did. If we can get scopes on more weapons, I want every capable shooter in this company able to engage at extended range. Sir, the monofilament mount technique isn't complicated. Any fisherman could do it. The hard part is the ballistic calculation and the patience to read the wind. Then teach them that too. Because I have a feeling this battle isn't over, and that's not the last German sniper we're going to face." Stern turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing, McGuire. What your father taught you. The knots, the patience, the reading of the wind. That just saved American lives. I want you to know that." Eddie thought about Thomas McGuire, who had never come home from the sea, who had never known that the things he taught his son on the deck of the Mary Ellen would one day be applied to a war he never imagined. "Thank you, sir. I think he would have wanted it that way." Stern nodded and walked away. Eddie sat behind the stone wall and looked at his carbine with its impossible scope mount and thought about the man on the ridge who had stopped shooting. He hoped the German was dead. Clean quick the way his father would have wanted a deer taken. One shot, one life, no suffering, but he also thought about who that man might have been. A soldier doing his job. A man with a family, probably. Someone's son. The thought lasted 3 seconds. Then Eddie put it away in the place where soldiers put the things they cannot afford to feel during a war, and he picked up his carbine and began preparing for whatever came next. What came next was 3 weeks that changed the way Eddie Maguire's company fought the Battle of the Bulge. On December 22nd, the day after the sniper kill, a patrol reached the ridge and confirmed what Eddie and Novak had suspected. The German sniper was dead. They found him in his depression between the spruce trees, face down in the frozen earth, a single wound in his upper chest. The .30 carbine round had entered just below the left collarbone, traveled downward, and lodged near the spine. Death had been almost instantaneous. Beside him was his Carabiner 98K, his ZF-41 scope, a notebook containing a hand-drawn map of the American positions, and a letter from his wife in Goslar asking him to come home for Christmas. The patrol brought back the German's weapon and Eddie's spent bullet, which the company medic extracted from the body for examination. The bullet was badly deformed, its copper jacket stripped, and its lid core flattened from the long flight and the impact, but it had arrived with enough energy to penetrate the chest cavity and sever the aorta. At 1,400 yards with the pistol caliber round, it had killed as efficiently as a rifle bullet at 500. Novak showed the bullet to the soldiers who had laughed at Eddie's fishing wire scope mount 4 days earlier. Nobody laughed. The rifleman from the 422nd who had told Eddie to go back to typing reports looked at the deformed bullet for a long time and then walked away without saying anything. Word spread through the company the way it always spreads. Not through official channels. Through the whisper network of men in foxholes. The headquarters clerk killed a German sniper at 1,400 yards with a carbine, with a scope held on with fishing line. That's impossible. Tell that to the 12 Americans who aren't getting shot at anymore. Eddie began teaching, not formally, not in a classroom, but in the way that skills are always taught in combat. One man at a time, squatting in a foxhole with a carbine and a spool of monofilament showing calloused hands how to wrap a scope mount that would hold. The first man he taught was Novak. The sergeant had found another damaged scope in the wreckage of an abandoned Jeep, a commercial hunting scope that had been brought to Europe by an officer who apparently thought he might do some recreational shooting between battles. It was a 2.5 power, Lyman Alaskan, not as good as Eddie's Weaver 330, but functional. Eddie showed Novak the wrapping technique. Start here, 12 turns tight each one, seated against the last. Now the cross wrap, figure 8. Feel the tension. Not too tight. Not loose, like this. Novak's hands were thick and clumsy compared to Eddie's, but he was a patient man and a fast learner. By the end of the afternoon, he had a scope mounted on his M1 Garand that was solid enough to hold 0. The Garand was a better platform for the scope than the carbine. Its .30-06 round was faster, flatter shooting, and carried more energy at range. Novak wouldn't need to aim at the sky the way Eddie did. At 800 yards, the Garand's bullet dropped perhaps 12 feet, a fraction of the carbine's 32-foot drop at the same range. But the monofilament mount worked the same way on both weapons. The vibration absorption, the self-centering after recoil, the weatherproof durability. The fishing wire didn't care what weapon it was attached to. It held because physics said it would hold, and Thomas Maguire's knots didn't fail. Over the next week, Eddie mounted scopes on 7 more weapons. M1 Garands, another carbine, even a BAR for a machine gunner named Pete Kowalski, who wanted to be able to aim his automatic weapon with precision at medium range. Each mount used the same technique. Each one held. Each one turned a standard infantry weapon into something that could reach farther and hit harder than the Army had ever intended. The effect on the company was immediate and measurable. Before Eddie's innovation, the American defensive perimeter had been terrorized by German fire from positions beyond effective range. After the Americans could shoot back. Not with the volume of fire that an artillery battery could produce, but with precision. One round carefully aimed at ranges that the Germans believed were safe. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical impact. German soldiers who had moved freely behind their own lines, confident that 800 or 1,000 yards of distance made them invisible, began finding that bullets arrived without warning from positions they had considered beyond American reach. An officer walking between bunkers was hit at 900 yards. A machine gun team setting up a new position was engaged at 1,100 yards. A forward observer directing mortar fire from a tree platform was killed at 1,200 yards by Novak, who had refined his marksmanship with the scope-mounted Garand to a level that impressed even Eddie. The Germans responded the way professional soldiers respond to an unexpected capability. They adapted. They moved more carefully, They stayed lower. They stopped exposing themselves at distances they had previously considered safe. Captain Stern put it simply in a conversation with Eddie on December 28th. We're advancing faster in this sector than anyone expected. Division wants to know why. I told them we have a corporal from Maine who mounted scopes on carbines with fishing line and taught half the company to shoot like snipers. What did Division say? They said that's impossible. Then they asked me to send them one of your mounted weapons for evaluation. Eddie almost smiled. Did you? I sent them. Novak's Garand, with a note explaining the monofilament technique. I also included your range cards and ballistic calculations. If they're smart, they'll pay attention. And if they're not, then we keep doing what works and let them catch up. The letter arrived on January 3rd, 1945, forwarded through 3 different mail drops and smudged with mud and what might have been coffee. Eddie recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Ray Pelletier. Eddie, they've got me in a hospital in Paris. Can you believe that, Paris? I've never been anywhere fancier than Boston, and now I'm in Paris with my arm in a sling eating French bread and drinking wine that some nurse smuggled in. The arm is healing fine. Doctor says I'll keep it, might even get full movement back. I got lucky. A lot of guys here weren't as lucky. I heard what you did. Don't ask me how. Word travels even to hospitals. A guy from the 106th came in with frostbite, and he was telling everyone about the headquarters clerk who killed a German sniper at 1,400 yards with a carbine and fishing wire. I said, that's my buddy, and nobody believed me until I described you and the Maine accent and the way you squint when you're thinking. Eddie, I told you not to waste what your father gave you. You listened. You crazy, stubborn Maine fisherman, you listened. Your mother is going to be so proud. I'm going to write her tonight and tell her that her son is the best shot in the United States Army and he learned it throwing nets in Penobscot Bay. Come home alive, Eddie. That's an order from your spotter. Even if I wasn't there to spot for you, I'm claiming credit for the assist. Your friend always, Ray. P.S. Louise says hello. She says to tell the fisherman to stop showing off and come home. She's tired of writing letters. Eddie read the letter 3 times, sitting in his foxhole, holding it carefully, because the paper was thin and fragile from its journey across France. He read it until he had memorized every word, and then he folded it and put it in his jacket pocket next to his mother's letter, and Ray's picture, and the small spool of monofilament that he kept as a spare, in case a scope mount needed repair. He didn't cry. Fishermen's sons from Maine didn't cry in foxholes in Belgium, but his eyes were wet, and he blamed the wind. The Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945. The German offensive had failed. The Americans had held at enormous cost and were pushing the Germans back toward their own border. Eddie Maguire's company, or what was left of it, had held its sector of the line for 38 days. In that time, Eddie had made 47 confirmed shots at ranges between 600 and 1,400 yards. 16 were confirmed kills. 23 were probable hits where the target went down or abandoned their position, but could not be confirmed from the American side. 8 were clean misses documented honestly in the shooting log that Novak kept with military precision. An accuracy rate of 83% at ranges that the Army said were impossible for the weapons being used. Every shot fired from an M1 carbine with a scope mounted by fishing wire. But the numbers were not the story. The story was what those shots had done to the behavior of the German forces facing Eddie's sector. Observation posts abandoned, movement restricted. Supply routes rerouted to avoid the zones that Eddie's scoped weapons could cover. A perimeter of psychological pressure that extended far beyond the physical range of the weapons because the Germans could never be certain exactly how far the Americans could now reach. Stern documented everything. His after-action report was 11 pages long, detailing the monofilament scope mounting technique with diagrams that Eddie drew from memory. The ballistic calculations for the .30 carbine round at extended ranges. The wind reading methodology adapted from commercial fishing, and the training program that had put scoped weapons in the hands of 7 additional soldiers. The report went to division, then to corps, then to Army headquarters. It arrived at a desk in Washington in February 1945, where it was read by a colonel in the Ordnance Department who had spent his career designing weapons and who stared at the diagrams of a fishing wire scope mount for a very long time. The colonel's name was Robert Hayward, and he was a practical man who cared more about results than regulations. He wrote a single note in the margin of Stern's report. If this technique is reproducible, it has implications for every weapon in the current inventory. Recommend immediate testing and evaluation. Forward to sniper training section. The technique was reproducible. Army armorers at Aberdeen Proving Ground tested the monofilament scope mount in March 1945 and found that it performed within 5% of the accuracy of purpose-built metal mounts, while offering superior vibration dampening and requiring zero specialized hardware. The 30 carbine ballistic data that Eddie had calculated by hand was verified by the same armorers using laboratory chronographs and ballistic gelatin. His numbers were within 3% of the laboratory results at every range increment. A fisherman's son with a pencil and a notebook working by candlelight in a foxhole had calculated terminal ballistics more accurately than many trained ordnance engineers could have done with their standard reference tables, because the standard reference tables didn't cover the ranges Eddie was shooting at. Nobody had ever bothered to calculate .30 carbine performance at 1,400 yards, because nobody had ever imagined anyone would try to shoot that far. The fishing wire scope mount never became official Army doctrine. The war ended before it could be formally adopted, and the post-war Army moved quickly toward purpose-built scope mounting systems that could be manufactured in factories rather than improvised in foxholes. But the concept, the idea that flexible vibration-absorbing mounts could outperform rigid metal mounts for precision shooting, influenced scope mounting design for decades. Modern sniper rifles use mounting systems that incorporate controlled flex and vibration dampening principles that trace their lineage through a long chain of engineering development back to a spool of fishing line on a stone wall in Belgium. Nobody remembers that lineage. Nobody connects the modern scope mount to a fisherman's son from Maine. History doesn't track ideas at that level of granularity, but the DNA is there in every scope that sits perfectly still after the recoil pulse passes through it, absorbing the shock instead of transmitting it. Thomas Maguire's knots evolved into engineering are still holding. Eddie Maguire went home in September 1945. He took a train from Boston to Rockland, and then a bus from Rockland to Thomaston, and then he walked the last mile from the bus stop to his mother's house on the hill above the harbor. Ruth Maguire was waiting on the porch. She was 52 years old, and she had lost her husband to the sea and spent 4 years waiting for the sea or the war or something to take her son. She had prayed every Sunday at the Federated Church in Thomaston, and she had written letters every week, and she had kept the porch light on every night in case Eddie came home in the dark, the way Thomas used to come home from the boat in the dark, walking up the hill with the smell of salt and fish on his clothes. Eddie dropped his duffel bag at the bottom of the steps and looked at his mother and couldn't find any words for what he wanted to say. Ruth came down the steps and put her arms around her son and held him the way she had held him when he was 7 years old and afraid of the storms that shook the house in winter. "You're home," she said. "That's all. That's everything." They stood there for a long time. Ray Pelletier showed up in Thomaston 3 weeks later driving a borrowed car from Lewiston, with his left arm still in a sling. He had a bottle of French wine which he said he had been saving since Paris, and a grin that hadn't changed since the troopship crossing. They sat on the porch of Ruth Maguire's house, drinking the French wine out of coffee cups, because Ruth didn't own wine glasses looking out at Penobscot Bay, which was gray and cold and beautiful in the October light. "You actually killed a German sniper at 1,400 yards with a carbine and fishing line." Ray said it like he still couldn't quite believe it, even though he'd been telling the story for months. "I had a good spotter. I was in a hospital in Paris. You spotted me before I knew I needed spotting. You told me not to waste what my father gave me. That was the spot that mattered." Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he lifted his coffee cup. "To Thomas Maguire, the best shooting instructor the United States Army never knew it had." Eddie lifted his cup. "To Thomas Maguire, and to the Mary Ellen, and to the knots that hold." They drank. The wine was good, better than anything either of them had tasted before, and the bay was beautiful, and they were alive, and that was enough. Ray stayed for the weekend. On Saturday morning, Eddie took him down to the harbor and showed him where the Mary Ellen used to tie up, and told him about the fishing and the lobster traps, and the way Thomas Maguire could read the water. And Ray listened with the particular attention of a man who understood that he was hearing the origin story of something important. Before he left, Ray gave Eddie a package. It was small, wrapped in brown paper. "What's this? Open it." Inside was a spool of monofilament fishing line. 60-pound test. The same kind Eddie had carried through Belgium. "I found it in a fishing supply store in Portland." Ray's voice was carefully casual. "Figured you might need it. You know, for fishing." Eddie looked at the spool and then at his friend and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the spool didn't already say. Some gifts are objects. Some gifts are memories. Some gifts are promises fulfilled. This was all three. Chang. Eddie McGuire did not become famous. He went back to Thomaston and bought a lobster boat with his mustering out pay and GI Bill benefits. He named it the Ruth M. after his mother. He fished Penobscot Bay the way his father had fished it, with patience and precision, and the understanding that the sea provides for men who respect it. He married a woman named Helen Chambers in 1947, a nurse from Camden who had served in the Army Nurse Corps in England during the war, and who understood the particular quiet that combat veterans carried without needing it explained. They had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Eddie taught all of them to fish, and all of them to tie knots, and all of them the lesson that Thomas McGuire had taught him. You read the situation until you understand it completely. Then you commit everything to a single moment of action. 1 throw, 1 net, 1 chance. If you've done the preparation, you don't need a second. He never talked about the war in public. When people asked, he said he had been a clerk in a headquarters company, which was true. He didn't mention the carbine, the scope, the fishing wire, the 400-yard shot, the 38 days on a Belgian ridgeline, where he had taught a company of support troops to shoot like snipers. That was between him and the men who had been there. But on certain evenings when the light was right, and the bay was calm, and the lobster traps were all set, and there was nothing to do but sit and watch the water, Eddie would take out the spool of monofilament that Ray had given him and turn it over in his hands, feeling the smooth plastic line against his calloused fingers, and he would think about his father. He would think about the knots, about the patience, about the way Thomas McGuire had looked at the water every morning with the same careful attention that Eddie had learned to give to a ridgeline in Belgium. He would think about the fact that his father had never known what his lessons would be used for, that the skills Thomas taught his son for catching fish would one day be used for catching men, and he would sit with the weight of that for as long as it took for the weight to become bearable. Then he would put the spool away and go inside and sit with Helen and the children and eat dinner and be the man his father had raised him to be, a man who prepared before the moment of pressure, a man who committed fully when the moment came, a man who kept his promises. Thomas McGuire had drowned in Penobscot Bay in 1938, and his body was never found, and his son had carried his lessons across an ocean and into a war, and had used them to save American lives with a piece of fishing wire that cost 11 cents. That is the story. Not of a weapon, not of a scope mount, not of a shot that shouldn't have been possible. The story is of what a father gives a son when he doesn't know he's giving it. The knowledge that passes between generations without ceremony, without documentation, without anyone understanding its full value until the moment arrives when it is needed. Thomas McGuire taught his son to tie knots. Those knots held a scope to a carbine in a frozen foxhole in Belgium and changed the ballistic equation of one section of one battle in one war. And the son who tied those knots came home to the bay where he learned them, and he tied them again for lobster traps, this time the way his father had tied them, with patience and precision, and the conviction that a connection made right will hold against whatever the world sends against it. The M1 carbine that Eddie McGuire carried through the Battle of the Bulge was turned into the Army when he was discharged. The fishing wire scope mount was removed. The weapon was returned to its standard configuration and put back into inventory as if the previous 38 days had not happened. The monofilament wrapping was thrown away. The range card on the back of a ration box was lost. The scope was transferred to another unit and eventually destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1952. Nothing physical remains of what Eddie McGuire built on a frozen night in Belgium. But the idea remains. The understanding that a flexible mount absorbs vibration better than a rigid one. The knowledge that the .30 caliber carbine round and rounds like it can reach farther than doctrine says when the shooter understands the physics of the trajectory. The principle that patient observation and mathematical preparation can extend the effective range of any weapon beyond what its designers imagined. These ideas traveled forward through time through military doctrine and engineering development, and the stories that soldiers tell other soldiers in quiet moments without anyone tracing them back to a spool of fishing wire and a fisherman's son who asked a different question than anyone else was asking. The question the Army asked was, "What can this weapon do?" The question Eddie McGuire asked was, "What can this weapon do if I understand it completely and apply everything my father taught me? Those are different questions, and the distance between them. The distance between accepting what you are told a tool can do and discovering for yourself what it is actually capable of is the distance between an M1 carbine and a sniper rifle, the distance between 200 yards and 1,400, the distance between giving up and figuring it out. Eddie McGuire died in 2003 at the age of 83 in his home in Thomaston, Maine, with Helen beside him and his children around him and the bay visible through the bedroom window. His obituary mentioned his war service, his decades of lobster fishing, his involvement in the Thomaston community. It did not mention a German sniper on a Belgian ridge. It did not mention fishing wire. It did not mention a shot that the Army said was impossible, made with a weapon the Army said couldn't make it held together by knots that a fisherman's son learned on a lobster boat in Penobscot Bay. But in the years after his death, military historians researching scope mounting technology during World War II found references to the Stern Report, the after-action document that Captain Harold Stern had submitted in January 1945, describing a monofilament scope mounting technique developed by a corporal in his headquarters company. The historians tracked the report through the Army archives and found Colonel Hayward's margin note. They found the Aberdeen Proving Ground test results. They found the thread that connected a fishing wire scope mount in 1944 to the vibration dampening principles in modern precision rifle systems. And they found Eddie McGuire's name, a corporal from Thomaston, Maine, a fisherman's son who had never been to sniper school, who had never trained as a marksman, who had carried a clerk's weapon and turned it into something the Army's best engineers had never imagined. There is a lesson in that, and it is the same lesson that Thomas McGuire taught his son on the deck of the Mary Ellen, and that Eddie McGuire taught the men in his company on a frozen ridgeline in Belgium, and that the knots themselves teach to anyone who learns to tie them. A connection made right will hold. Preparation done before the moment of pressure determines the outcome during the moment of pressure. You do not accept the definition someone else has given you of what your tools can do. You understand them completely. You calculate. You prepare. And then when the moment comes, you commit everything to a single action with full confidence in your preparation. One throw, one net, one shot, one knot that holds.